Hi, everyone. Before the episode begins, I just want to remind you to follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Marlene the Plant Lady and YouTube, Everything Gardening with Marlene Simon. And remember, please, please, please rate and review on iTunes and Spotify. That just helps the podcast get noticed by more people, and then more people will become better gardeners. And that's what we all want. So enjoy the episode.
Look at that plant. I want you to know that everything was grown in my garden. Don't touch that plant!
Is it poisonous?
She'll become part of the plant.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flower Power Garden Hour. I'm your host, Marlene, and tonight we're going to be talking about fall garden prep. So with me is the Vice President of Horticulture from the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, Andrew Bunting. And when I was looking over his bio and his speaking topics, he obviously, to be vice president of this organization, you have to have a broad knowledge of plants. And then I also saw that he does talks about hydrangeas, and I got really excited. So we're going to throw in a little bit of hydrangea care, but mainly focus on what to do this time of year in your garden. And so with me is Andrew. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start first about hearing a little bit about you, what you do, and what the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society is about. So I'll just let you take it away from there.
Sure. In my position as Vice President of Horticulture at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, I get involved in multiple aspects of the organization. So I act in an advisory role with our public gardens and landscapes. So we maintain 20 public gardens and landscapes throughout mostly the city, but we also have one in the northern suburbs. So these are gardens and landscapes that are free and open to the public all the time. So they're very, very, very public, but also very accessible. I also am involved in the flower show. Almost everybody at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, in one way or another, is involved with the flower show. So I also act in an advisory role there, and then I help out with different aspects of what's called the horticourt. That's the area of the flower show where individuals bring plants to be judged. So I help with that to help identify perhaps new exhibitors or look at different classes that we might add or change and so forth. Then I also get involved in some of the fundraising and development aspects. And then one of the biggest things that I do is kind of what I'm doing today. I do a lot of or participate in a lot of podcasts. I do a lot of writing and interviews and other forms of communication. And PHS is, as you may know, is a very old organization. It was founded in 1827, and it's had many different kind of iterations of what it does over the years. Today, it's very much an organization that engages with people in all sorts of different ways. So we want to work with people throughout the city and the surrounding communities to really engage them with gardening and horticulture. And that may be in many different ways, and it may be in many different paths. So some of our constituents may be first-time gardeners. They may have never gardened before in their life. So we really want to engage those people and give them a pathway to gardening, whether it's vegetable gardening or ornamental gardening or planting street trees or cleaning and greening of vacant lots. So we really want to engage people in horticulture and use horticulture as a means for social change. So we feel that gardening can do a lot for a lot of people. We know that cleaning and greening of vacant lots, for example, reduces crime, reduces mental health issues, raises property values, makes areas feel safer. So we do a lot of clean or greening initiatives in areas, especially the city, where there's other equity issues, including green equity issues. So in those parts of the city, we're cleaning and greening vacant lots. We're planting street trees. We're working with over 125 different community gardens and helping facilitate activities there, whether it's growing seedlings and distributing them, or helping them connect with, say, a local food bank so that they can share some of the harvest from their gardens. So we're very much about kind of meeting people where they are in their gardening journey, and then really using horticulture for a number of different ways to help facilitate a number of, I guess, mechanisms for social change.
Yeah, it's endless with gardening and horticulture. I mean, it sounds like you guys are doing a great job of diversifying yourself and getting yourself involved in all aspects of that, which is great. As people know, there's horticultural therapy, and as you said, it reduces mental health issues. And when you have a beautiful area, or at least you give people some skills, they start owning it, and then with ownership becomes a sense of confidence. And with that, especially with young kids, that's something that a lot of kids need these days. So kudos to you guys. I mean, for being around since 1827, it seems like you've got it dialed in pretty darn good.
Yeah, of course, it's, we've not always done these kind of social-based programs, but I would say that's been a hallmark of PHS for at least the last 40 years or so.
Yeah.
And I would say a lot of those programs have increased over time. Another significant program we do is workforce development. So we're training people with kind of basic gardening skills, and then helping them find jobs.
Yeah, that's really important. I just see that even where I'm at it, we have an internship program at the university I work at, and it's funny, students come in with one major, but then they start working for us, 2 years under their belt, and they graduate, and they usually get jobs working in the greenhouse industry, which there's a lot of around us. So it's these skills that are very marketable.
Absolutely. There's I would say around any major city, there's always green jobs to be found, whether it's in landscape maintenance, landscaping, greenhouse, golf courses. There's plenty of green jobs.
Exactly. Well, let's start going into fall garden. It finally, 2 weeks ago, was it 2 weeks ago? We had 116-degree weather here, and then just last night and yesterday we had, like, for us, torrential rainfall, which is very rare. So it's finally feeling like fall. And you said it's cooling down a bit in Pennsylvania. I'm sure the leaves are changing color. But let's go through why fall is sort of a crucial time in the garden. And let's start with planting. Why fall is a key time for planting, and what people can plant, and maybe what they should avoid planting.
Sure. So, probably for the last 20 years or so, I would say the garden center industry has really been promoting, kind of the tagline, fall is for planting. And I would say in most parts of the United States, at least the temperate parts of the United States, this does make sense for a number of reasons. So, and this would be, and we can go into what you might avoid planting, but for things like deciduous trees and shrubs and perennials, the advantage of planting in the fall versus the spring is that instead of it getting warmer, it's getting cooler, but the soil temperature, while it's also cooling down, it cools down at a slower rate. So in theory, the air temperature is cool. So there's less stresses on the plant because of that. Generally, we've had some moisture in the fall, so maybe the soil is as moist, if not more moist, than perhaps what it would be in the spring. And then the soil temperature is warm. So even though the plant may look like it's either going dormant or has gone dormant, like with a shrub or a tree, maybe all the leaves have actually fallen off, but the roots are still active. So in theory, you put it in the hole and plant it. And while the top is dormant or going dormant, there's still active root growth. And in the mid-Atlantic, where I live, that root growth can literally happen from now, say middle of September, all the way through, I would say well into December. So the goal would be to plant something and hope that it at least establishes a root system before it goes into the colder parts of the winter. Now, if you live in, say, the southeastern U.S. or Florida or California, in theory you can plant throughout the entire winter as well. But let's say for the Midwest and Northeast and mountain states, and this is all going to vary on where you live. The window will be more narrow, say in Chicago, than it is in Pennsylvania. But in this area, we can legitimately plant perennials, deciduous trees, deciduous shrubs, probably into at least November. Maybe a little later, depending on how warm the fall is. Now, the type of plants you might want to think a bit more about would be evergreen conifers like pines and spruces and thuya and arborvitae and things like that. And then broadleaf evergreens, things like rhododendrons, camellias, acuba, hollies, anything that has a broader leaf that remains evergreen for the winter. Now, it's not to say you can't plant those, but if I was going to plant any of those, I would narrow the window considerably. So I might only plant those in, say, middle of September to middle of October, because what you run the risk with evergreens is if they haven't established themselves enough or get established enough of a root system, because they have evergreen leaves, even in the fall and winter, there's transpiring moisture out of those leaves. And if they don't have an established enough root system to pull moisture out of the ground, then you sometimes get burning or desiccation of the leaves if they're not well enough established going into the fall. So it's not that you can't do it. It's just that you need to be more mindful of it. And again, in places like, the South, from say, probably North Carolina South, the whole southeastern parts of the United States, planting evergreens, broadleafed or coniferous evergreens, probably well into the winter is okay, because they're going to get root growth or root growth establishment, fairly far into late fall or even into the winter.
Yeah, that's what so I'm in Northern California, which is different than, Southern California. We do get a normal bit of frost. And I always tell people that certain plants going into like November to avoid would be citrus and certain frost sensitive like salvias, because they're just not established when that cold comes. But, fall is sort of this big, technically I don't think we're in fall, but we always consider mid-September. Well, actually, I guess it would be, right now it's still warm. But then, November is still fall, and that's a big difference. So it's true. Look at your zone, figure out when you get that really cold weather setting in, and go from there. But those are good points about getting the roots established, how it's warm, and then the broad-leafed plants. And it is funny sometimes when you put these plants in the ground, like these herbaceous perennials. Yeah, I'm sure you get pictures where people are like, "Oh, this died." Well, it's not necessarily dead. It's getting all of its roots established, and then spring, if you just leave it in there, spring it'll just come out full blast. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you really get, by planting in the fall, you almost are kind of getting a head start on the spring. So, whether it's perennials or shrubs or trees, you get them planted, they get, somewhat established, and then, fast forward to spring, they kind of come out of spring even in a little bit more robust form than they might be if you planted them in the spring. And then also, a lot of garden centers and nurseries have fall sales because they're trying to, essentially liquidate their inventory for the winter. So it's often a kind of an economical time to be adding plants to the garden as well.
True. What do you mean by one of your talking points? It was putting your garden to bed. So go over what some of the steps people should do to prep their garden. Things you should be aware of that shouldn't be overwintering in your garden if you're in a cold area.
Sure. Yeah. So, and kind of putting your garden to bed, I would say nowadays there's probably two different approaches. One is kind of the traditional approach of going into your garden, cutting back perennials that have gotten frosted and look brown or black, cleaning up everything in the garden, raking the leaves, just kind of tidying up everything for the winter. So that is one approach, but there is a massive movement happening probably throughout the world, but definitely throughout most parts of the United States, to have your garden also be an active part of your local ecosystem. So in that case, you may want to be really thoughtful about what you do, what you cut down and what you don't cut down. So, it is accepting kind of a new or changing aesthetic to think about not cutting down perennials for the winter. And the reason you wouldn't cut them down is they can provide habitat for all sorts of insects that might hibernate or overwinter in the hollow parts of perennial stems or grass stems. So I was just listening to a talk by Rebecca McMacken, who's a kind of a horticultural ecologist, and she most recently was director of Brooklyn Bridge Park. And she fully gets that, a lot of people, whether they're property owners or home gardeners or whoever, want to keep their garden somewhat tidy. So what she recommends is maybe doing something in between. So you might still cut back most of the perennials, but you might leave, instead of cutting them to the ground, you might leave some stubs of, say, a foot or so, which still gives places for any number of animals, especially insects, to overwinter in. So that might be one kind of in between approach. Another one is what do you do with your leaves? So there's another movement called Leave the Leaves, which is, leave your leaves in your garden, allow them to decompose like they would in nature. Like, if you go into any woodland, natural woodland, the leaves fall to the ground, they decompose, and then the perennials and ferns and shrubs, emerge through those the following spring. Again, it's an aesthetic decision. A lot of people want to clean those out of their beds, but it's also in kind of that duff of leaves that, a lot of organisms overwinter and need for shelter. So, maybe another in between approach would be that and I know a lot of people that do this, they rake the leaves out into the lawn and then run over them, multiple times with a lawnmower. So kind of chop them up, or even send them through some sort of shredder, and then take the shredded leaves and put those back into the beds as an organic mulch. So for some people, that aesthetic is a little tidier than big, especially if you have big leaves like, say, London plane trees or sycamores, or I know on the West Coast you have the big leaf maple, things like that may seem just too coarse. So by chopping them up, you still get the organic value. There's still, some kind of leaf litter for organisms to overwinter, but it's a tidier effect in the garden.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's we're telling people to do that, and it's great practice. I remember when I was interning at Sunset Western magazine, and this was back in the early 90s. And it was Bud Stuckey, who was the test garden coordinator. And it was like the first time I was introduced sort of to this true organic movement. But then there was the people in charge of the display gardens would rake every single leaf up. And I remember hearing him just grumble about, oh, they're raking every single leaf up. And he's like, I'm leaving every single leaf in here. And I'm like looking at both of them, and I could see the balance as people want it to look. Even in my garden, I'm like, oh, it looks like I didn't do anything. I need to clean some up. So, but one caveat I wanted to add is, vegetable gardens. And what I tell people is if there's any chance that there's a disease, or if you've had a major pest on a tree, do you recommend people try to get the majority of those leaves up and removed?
Yes. Yeah. So, I think it can be kind of twofold. If you can take a more organic approach to, leaving material in the garden, you should. But again, that comes down to personal choice. But if it is diseased, whether it's a tree or a tomato would be a good example. All that stuff I would just kind of gather up and throw on the compost pile. So, the other thing I advocate for is I share a compost pile with my neighbors, and everything, whether it's leaves from the garden or, old vegetables or anything that's organic goes onto those piles. And we're able to compost everything from our yards or gardens in those compost piles. So we each have a city lot that's a third of an acre. But I think, unless you have a massive property, although if you have a massive property, you have more room for more composting. Even little city dwellers should be able to compost most everything on site. And then, you have access to compost that can be used for, kind of a potting soil, or, added into kind of homemade potting soil. So, that would be another thing for homeowners to consider. Another thing that I'm thinking about this time of year is I grow a lot of annuals, but I also grow a lot of annuals that are more kind of tropical plants or tropical in nature, things like bananas, cannas, elephant ears. So those, in my climate, they have to come in for the winter. It's too cold for them to survive. Now, as you go south again, like, the southeastern U.S., a lot of cannas, elephant ears, and bananas are hardy, and they may be hardy in northern or parts of California for sure. But for us, they need to come in for the winter. And what I do, and it's easy, is actually let them get frosted. And for the cannas, which have a underground rhizome, a fleshy root, I just cut them to the ground and just dig up the fleshy root, put the root in a black nursery pot with a little bit of compost um, or mulch, and they just sit in my kind of cool basement for the winter. So it's kind of cellar-like conditions. I do the same thing with the elephant ear, which is, instead of a fleshy root, is a big tuber, and it gets treated the same way. And then the bananas, and we do have a banana that's hardy, Mousse Sebastiou, but the other bananas, they get frosted, cut them back to a main stem, dig up the trunk, put it in the basement with, again, a little bit of compost or mulch, and they just kind of sit down there for, by the time I get them in, it's probably middle of November, and they sit down there till the middle of May. They actually look like they're dead. And then I bring them up in the middle of May and plant them. And, then you can have these kind of exuberant tropical looking plants in a temperate garden for the subsequent summer. Now, a lot of annuals that are not hardy, I just often let them get frosted. Some things I'll collect seed on and maybe start some seed under lights over the winter. But a lot of things I just figure I'll go to the garden center and get new varieties the subsequent year. So I do know that, not everything can be kept over from year to year.
Yeah, we're in Northern California, canna lilies are no problem in the ground.
Yeah.
And for the most part, bananas, especially if they're planted like on a south wall,
Right.
will be okay. They don't look good in winter, especially with a cold spell. And generally people don't get them to fruit outside. So it's more of an ornamental. And yeah, the elephant ears, that's always, an iffy one, because a lot of times it's the rains, if people don't have good drainage, just rots out.
Yes.
So that's a good reason just to even bring them up if you're having issues and not good draining. Do you grow dahlias?
Yeah, so dahlias I would treat the same way as the cannas and elephant ears. Let them get frosted. They have a tuber, not that dissimilar to the elephant ears. Dig that up, put it in. And the idea with whatever you hold them in over winter is it needs to just only hold the slightest amount of moisture, because you don't want it moist, because otherwise they're going to rot. You don't want them to grow either, so you want it kind of in a dark, dank cellar-like basement or cellar. So yeah, kind of the same treatment for dahlias, and that's a great way. With all these things, like once you plant one, the mass is gonna get bigger over the summer. So if you plant one dahlia, you'll have 5 to 10 dahlia tubers by the end of the summer. So it's a great way to also, if you want more, if you want to share with your neighbors, to kind of build out your holdings of these different plants.
Yeah, and for us, things that people don't dig up in the fall because it's not necessary. Fall is a good time to dig them up and divide them anyways, because they start crowding each other out and you can start getting smaller flowers or no flowers.
Yeah, that's right. For us, even like cannas, it's interesting in the last 30 years, like 30 years ago, no cannas were hardy. And I would say now half of them are hardy, especially if they're planted up against a house or in a courtyard or something like that. So yeah, it would be, whether it's a canna or other perennials. Fall's also a good time to divide things, to move things around in the garden. Again, making sure there's enough time left at the end of the season before it gets too cold, because you want anything you've divided to root in as well before you go into the colder parts of the winter.
Are you guys doing a big tulip planting push now?
Yeah, so we do bulb planting. Most bulbs get planted in the fall. So we, in our public gardens and landscapes, we do both, seasonal kind of annual displays of tulips.
Hmm.
But we also do permanent displays we plant a lot of ornamental onions, the
Oh,
alliums.
yeah.
We plant a lot of daffodils, and then some of the smaller bulbs like snowdrops, snowflakes, scillas, muscaris, and so on. So we would probably not really start most of that planting till probably at the earliest, the middle of October.
Hmm.
And we've gone as late as, it's not ideal, but it can be done as late as the end of December. So again, you almost have to think of the bulb as like you do anything else you would plant in the fall. Even though it's going in as a dormant bulb, at the base of the bulb is where the little roots form. So you will get root growth, and that's what you're hoping for. So, depending on the bulb, you plant it, say, 3 to 5 inches deep or a little deeper for some things, and put the basal part down. And from that, you'll get some root growth so that they establish themselves, so that when they start growing in early spring, and again, tulips will vary. Like for us, tulips typically bloom, end of March, early April, mid-April. Down south in places like Atlanta, they're in full flower in February. So, they're not in the ground very long, but for that short amount of time between the time they get planted in the fall till whenever they bloom, you want them to be establishing roots so that they can really jump out of the ground in full flower in spring, whenever spring would be, depending on where you live.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm surprised you guys pushed late December, but I guess it's depends on the year.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's not ideal. Sometimes, maybe other things are taking precedence, and it just
mhm.
pushes the calendar back. I would say the ideal time would be, mid-October to mid-November. That's probably a good window and that would be uh, post everywhere. So that would still be the time planting is happening in, let's say, Atlanta, and it'd be the same time we're thinking about doing it in, say, the Mid-Atlantic and in the
Yeah.
Midwest as well.
Yeah, it's same here for us. We don't get the cold. So tulips generally don't come back year to year for us. And if when in doubt, I tell people to put them in the fridge for a couple weeks to chill them initially. But generally, they're chilled when they come. So you get
Right.
some blooms, but tulips aren't big out west. Generally, if they bloom, then some wind comes and just shreds them too.
Yeah, we actually treat tulips as mostly as
Do
annuals
you? Okay.
because, even the second year, their flower power decreases by
Wow.
probably at least 75%. So I'd say most tulips, there are some perennial tulips, but most of them we treat as seasonal annuals, and then all the others would be planted more as
Okay.
permanent
Okay.
plants.
So that's same. I do want to touch. So it's fascinating to me because a lot of these same ideas sort of go across every zone. But as I'm sitting here talking to you, I'm thinking, I'm like, well, we prune our roses in January and we don't have to worry about them. Do you have to? Do you use a lot of straw around certain shrubs to protect? Do you cut your roses down in late fall to protect, or what do you do with some of your more woody shrubs?
Yeah, I would say around here we don't do anything.
Okay.
So
All right.
I'd say most everything is hardy. Even roses, you used to mulch them a little bit to protect them, but
Mhm.
I'd say most roses, hybrid teas, shrub roses, species roses are pretty hardy in this area. Now, places like Chicago, they need considerable mulching
Mm.
for the winter for additional protection. And most of our pruning of roses here would be late winter. So probably like March, we would go in and kind of prune the roses back. Either they just get pruned back because that's how they get treated, or you're looking at where they've died back to, and you kind of prune back to that point. And then other shrubs, I would say most everything in this area that we grow is perfectly hardy. So there's no need for straw or any type of winter mulching unless it's something that's really tender. And maybe if we're zone 7, it's a zone 8 or 8B plant, and we know that if we give it a little extra mulching, it'll be more likely to survive the winter. But in general, that's something we really don't do much.
Okay.
We don't do much with our shrubs in the heading into the winter.
Okay. You guys, you stay, I guess, quote, warmer than I thought you did.
Yeah, it's still plenty cold. Like somebody from Northern California, if they spent a winter in Philadelphia, would feel like it's really cold.
Yeah, I grew up in San Diego, so Northern California is still cold to me.
Yeah, but it's nothing compared to, say, Chicago or Minnesota.
Those Great Lakes up there really get pummeled. Okay,
yes.
So that's good, because I do see beautiful pictures of gardens in Pennsylvania, and I always show them to my husband, and he's like, no, it's too cold, you'll hate it. But now I have a little bit of
Now, it's actually, the local public gardens are part of a consortium called the Greater Philadelphia Gardens, and our tagline is America's Garden Capital. And the reason that we have that tagline is there's more public gardens per square mile or within a 50-mile radius of Philadelphia than anywhere else in the country.
Wow.
Now, it's probably, there's probably climates like the Bay Area, Northern California, the whole Pacific Northwest, where you can grow probably a greater variety of plants. But, our climate is such where we have almost equal amounts of moisture 12 months out of the year. So we're not like, a lot of parts of California where there's no rain, for months on end, or, the whole West Coast. So, while it is colder in the winter, in a lot of respects, it's a bit more hospitable gardening climate than a lot of places in the U.S.
Yeah. Midsummer here, it's pretty dreary out in the garden, where there, I imagine it's green and lush. I wanted to go back a little bit to what we were talking about, putting the beds to rest, and then sort of transitioning to that, how it's preparing for the next season. So you talked about, leaf debris and how it could be great to just leave in there because that's basically your compost. Do you add compost as well? If so, say someone cleaned everything up, and fertilizing. I know fall fertilizing is, there's people who swear by it, other people who say, no, don't do it. What are your thoughts on, and what do you do to amend the beds if there's anything besides just leaving the organic debris in?
Right. So if you have access to compost or leaf compost, or some people will mulch in the fall, and that's usually more of it's, I guess, probably nice to have a little bit of coverage in the beds. A lot of people do it for aesthetic reasons, or they just have access to extra kind of decomposed leaves. Like when I worked at the Scott Arboretum of Swarthmore College, which is nearby, we did all the composting of leaves for the township as well as the college. So we always had a lot to use. Most of our composting with the decomposed leaves, we would actually do in late winter, so that everything kind of emerged through that leaf, or the cover of decomposed leaves coming out of the winter. So, again, I would say in this area, it's not really necessary to mulch your beds in the fall, but if you want to, it doesn't doesn't hurt.
Okay.
And then then you might want to consider doing it later in the winter, not additionally, but as an alternative time to do it.
What about say people just have a pine tree or an evergreen tree and they hear things like, "Oh, I can't leave all these because they're too acidic," or they have tannins. What are your
That
thoughts on
all that
that?
can be left. So like, if you have pine trees and you have pine needles that fall down, you can just leave those. Other evergreens like cryptomerias or arborvitaes, etc. They all kind of drop stuff, and you can leave that as
Mhm.
well. One thing that I don't leave because it's just too heavy and it never decomposes properly. It are southern magnolia leaves, so Magnolia grandiflora, which I know
Mhm.
do equally well in California as they
Mhm.
do for us. And they, while it's an evergreen tree, they're constantly dropping these big,
Yeah.
kind of leathery evergreen leaves that just sit there. They don't really decompose, so I do clean those up, and they actually can be fairly messy as well. And I forgot to answer your second question, which was fall
Mhm.
fertilization. So I'm an advocate of zero synthetic fertilizers. Occasionally during the summer, I'll use, like a liquid fertilizer just to green up or give a little flower power to some of my annuals or tropicals.
Mhm.
But I don't, as a practice, I don't advocate for synthetic or even organic fertilizers for that
Mhm.
matter for most trees, shrubs, and perennials. If you're doing some level of adding organic matter, whether it's just top dressing a compost or with decomposed leaves and other matter, you're going to provide enough nutrients through those practices. And then a lot of natural soils, like our soils around here, have a fairly high nutrient content. But again, people will choose to do different levels of fertilization, either just to green things up. Uh, in our climate, uh, with especially evergreens, if you fertilize too far into the fall, what it does is it kind of triggers a growth spurt. And if you get the growth spurt and then that new growth doesn't harden off properly, going in the colder parts of the winter, then you can risk that new growth being burned by the cold weather in late fall or winter.
Mhm.
So, if you are going to do fertilization, you might want to think about doing it more during the growing season than kind of at the end of the season. And there's different fertilizers that also for plants that like soil more acidic. You
Mhm.
can add fertilizers that have um, something that's going to add acidity
Mhm.
to the soil. So that those are uh, considerations.
Yeah, no, so, I asked that question, generally every guest I have, whatever we're talking about, I always bring up fertilizer, and so far, every single and I try to have the best in the industry on, and,
Right.
it's the same thing. It's feed the soil. If you have a healthy soil, you leave organic debris in, maybe add compost, for, like, vegetable gardens and stuff. It goes to the same thing. No synthetic fertilizers, maybe a little bit of something like fish emulsion during the
Yeah.
early start of the growth, but other than that, most soils, we have clay soils here. It sounds like you have, healthy soils there. So, but it's so funny because especially new gardeners, they walk down aisles and aisles of fertilizers in the nursery, and it's all, hate to say it, it's all about marketing. Um, you need this for this plant and this for this plant, and it's almost never a lack of a nutrient that's going on as a plant problem. So, um,
Yeah, and I also feel like, and this would hold true for insecticides and
mhm,
and fungicides and so forth, as
mhm,
and I would say with nutrient deficiency as well as, I've always been of the mindset that plants aren't perfect. They
Yeah.
probably shouldn't be perfect. If something is totally getting chewed up by some pest, or is looking really awful because of a disease, then my approach is just to get rid of the plant.
Mhm.
Like if it's something that's going to require so much chemical inputs to keep it looking good, then it probably is not the best plant for my area or my garden, or the local climate.
Mhm.
Um, a good example, like hybrid teas and floribundas require, if you want a perfect rose, require a lot of fungicides and insecticides. But there's lots of roses. There's a lot of new selections that have been selected for their disease tolerance. They're more resilient to kind of hot summers, humid summers. So, and a lot of people, like again locally, the Scott Arboretum, their rose garden today, it has some nice roses in it, but it's a mix of a bunch of other things as well. So they only use organic practices in their rose garden, and in the peak of rose season, it's incredible. But it's also catmints and other
Mhm.
flowering plants mixed in, clematis growing up through the roses. So I think if we can just shift a little bit our expectations of what we think a garden should be and what plants in the garden should be, then I think we can be a little bit more lenient with some of these chemical inputs.
Exactly. Exactly. Plants aren't meant to look perfect.
No.
And don't fall for the Instagram pictures. There's
Right. No,
there's
no. I mean, there are a lot of plants that look amazing, but
yeah.
they can look amazing with actually a little human intervention.
Yeah. Or they look amazing for, like roses, the first blush of roses in spring,
Hmm.
just amazing. And then, when it's 110, they may not look the same. So, yeah.
Right. Right.
Um, I I want to pivot a little bit to hydrangeas.
Yes.
And it does fall into fall care, but as someone who doesn't grow a lot of hydrangeas, but I mean, I grew up in San Diego where our neighbor had this mass of these beautiful purple, hued, and they did absolutely nothing. And here where I'm at, people just struggle to have your basic pink mop head hydrangeas in some areas. Um, and I get questions like, why is my hydrangea not blooming? Why is it yellowing? So give us some tips on what people should do now and we'll focus on the big leafed hydrangeas, the mop
Yep.
head
Yep. Yep.
hydrangeas.
Yep. Yeah. When I have had previous jobs, the number one questions were all about all those things you just said. Why is it not flowering? Why is my pink hydrangea blue? Why is
Mhm.
my blue hydrangea pink?
Mhm.
And so forth. So, uh, you know, trying to grow the perfect kind of pink or blue mop head, really has to do with oftentimes where you live. Um, like maritime climates, like coastal areas, like San Diego,
Mhm.
or here like Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket. Like they can grow the best hydrangeas. So those type of hydrangeas, which if you could trace them back, are really kind of mountainous species from Japan and Korea. And so they don't want it too hot. They don't want it too cold. Now, one of the reasons why it might not be flowering, there's thousands of not that, yeah, probably a couple thousand cultivars of hydrangea macrophylla, and some are very hardy, and some are not very hardy at all. So with the macrophylla types, you need two, stems that are 2 years old for them to flower. So if you have a really tender cultivar, and during the winters that previous season's growth is die into the ground every year, you're never going to have mature enough stems for it to flower the subsequent summer. Now, there are new cultivars like the Endless Summer series and others that don't need older stems. They can actually die to the ground every year, grow back up, and flower.
Interesting.
So there's quite a few new series and cultivars that allow you to do that. Now, if you want a pink, whether it's a lace cap or a mop head, you need to have a pH. So the pH is what determines the acidity of the soil, and the scale is 1 to 14. So anything kind of let's just say upper 6s, 7 or above is you have alkaline soils, and your pink or blue hydrangea will be pink. Now, if you have an acidic soil, like for example, again, Martha's Vineyard, the soils there like 4.5, 5, 5.5, even 6 would all be considered acidic, and your hydrangeas are going to be blue. And there's really no you can go in and try to change a acidic soil to an alkaline soil by adding calcium-based products, and maybe you can shift it and turn your blue hydrangea pink, or conversely, your pink to blue. But that's why they're pink and while they're blue. Now, if you have a white hydrangea, it's going to be white whether it's acidic soil or alkaline soil. Now, hydrangea pruning, that often is a good reason why they don't flower the next year. So again, with macrophylla, you need 2-year-old stems. If you like pruning and you cut all your hydrangeas back by half every year, you've essentially pruned off the second year's growth. And so that would be a good reason why they might not be blooming. Now, a good way around all of this is like if you like the mop heads, there's a whole group called the smooth hydrangeas, like Hydrangea arborescens Annabelle. Completely blooms on new growth. And then there's a whole series now, like Invincible Spirit, which is a pink Annabelle, and a bunch of others that are in kind of pink and burgundy range. And the good thing about that whole series is they bloom on new wood, which means that you can cut them all the way to the ground, almost like a herbaceous perennial, and they'll grow back 3 or 4 feet and be covered in flowers every year, regardless, in the middle of summer. So that's a good way around dealing with the whole complications with the big leaf kind of classic hydrangeas. Now they don't come in, the arborescens type does not come in blue, so it's only going to be white or kind of variants of pink. But they're also exceptionally hardy. Like Hydrangea arborescens Annabelle is probably the most popular hydrangea in Chicago and the kind of upper Midwest, but it's also popular in Georgia or northern Florida, or all up and down the East Coast, all the way up into Maine, just because it's so hardy.
Yeah, I do wonder about that, because it's so if everything dies down, but then I do see pictures of these beautiful blue hydrangeas in the East Coast, but if it gets that cold and everything's dying down, so
yeah, but it's not everything does die down, because there's cultivars, all sorts of cultivars of macrophylla, that are very hardy. So you just have to do your research, and find the hardiest of. Like around here, we can grow. There's quite a few blues and pinks that do very well. There's one called Preziosa, which is kind of a reddish pink. And that blooms really well every year. It's just that a lot of these hydrangeas were actually bred for the florist industry. So either as like a potted plant you'd buy in the grocery store, or for cut flowers for the florist industry. And those tend to be the most tender, but somehow they get like, somebody takes the one that's in a little pot that they buy in the supermarket and then they plant it out.
Yeah.
And it's many of those that end up not being good garden plants. But there's some good references on hydrangeas, like Mike Durr wrote an entire book on hydrangeas. So I would just, for the listeners, go online or wherever and just find out how hardy the hydrangea is and make sure it's hardy enough to grow and flower well in your area.
No, those are good points. Here, they don't necessarily die down, but I think people don't like the looks of the bare sticks. So then they want to clean up their garden. So they cut them down.
Right, exactly.
And you don't even need to, unless it's getting crowded, you don't need to or they're very old stems, you don't need to remove them. So a lot of times I tell people don't do anything to them except for just remove the flowers at the very base of the flower.
Right. Take the flowers off, or you may want to go through and just do a little thinning of some of the stems. That make, kind of so-called clean it up a bit. But you're leaving enough, say 50% of the mature stems so that you get good flowering the subsequent summer.
Yeah.
Another hydrangea paniculata. That's called, often called the PG hydrangea. That's another one that's super hardy. There's many cultivars nowadays that has more of the cone-shaped flower, mainly whites, but there's some pinks as well. And that blooms on new wood too, like arborescens. So that for us, that's like a classic summer hydrangea. It loves the heat. I would think in like Northern California, it would probably be a good plant, as long as you can give it water during the summer.
Yeah, it's a nice one here. Little, afternoon shade is ideal for all these for the most part. They need sun, but that one especially needs a little afternoon shade. And it doesn't get as toasty, as crispy, and have as many issues as and like you said, these are coastal. They're like sort of almost cloud forest plants in Japan or coastal. So yeah, it's just when you're trying to grow them with 15% humidity, 100-degree weather, they're not so great.
Yeah, the best ones that I've seen, I've never seen them in person, but I've seen them online, is like Nantucket. I've seen pictures of like blue hydrangeas that are 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide, and you can't see the foliage for the flowers because there are so many flowers.
For me, that was Mendocino. Oh, besides the one in San Diego that I still remember from when I was like 5. Mendocino, which is about 90 minutes right along the coast. Oh my gosh, some of the most vibrant purple ones. And actually, I remember going to some parts of France I saw, and it was just like this purple that I've never seen before.
Yeah, France is ideal. In fact, the biggest collection is called the Shamrock Garden, is in France. Mendocino would be perfect. I'm sure like Bouchard Gardens on Vancouver Island is probably perfect.
Yeah. We always want what we can't have,
Right. Yes. That's one of the fun parts of gardening is coveting what you can't grow.
Exactly. And then, we don't want it to be a challenge, but sometimes that's the lure but really it is, we have pink ones here, and if it's like, okay, fine. But when you travel, that's why you got to travel and see different gardens. So you can be amazed. I don't want to keep you much longer. We're filming this or recording this in the morning, so I'm sure you've got work to do. But anything else you want to? What's the website for the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society so people could check it out?
Sure, it's phsonline.org. And
Okay.
one other thing I'll mention is we have a program called the Gold Medal Plant Program where we select every year only about 6 plants that are great
Mm-hmm.
stalwart gardening plants. They're not necessarily like brand new things,
Uh-huh.
but they're plants that have kind of stood the test of time. And if you go onto that website again, you'll find that. And even for, I'd say it's a great resource mostly for the Mid-Atlantic, but there's a lot of things on there I know do really well in the Midwest, the Southeast, Northern California for sure. So I think it's a good national resource for kind of the tried and true perennial shrubs, trees, and we also have a few vines in there as well.
Cool. People love plant guides. you
Yes.
know, and you have at least one book out, right? And I need to have you on about magnolias, but you wrote a book, The Plant Lover's Guide to Magnolias.
Yes. Yeah, that was through Timber Press, and that's part of a series
Okay.
that other authors have done. There's one on geraniums and sedums and,
Mm,
epimediums, I believe, and a bunch of other genera. So,
okay.
yeah, I'd be happy to talk to you about magnolias, and I could definitely do a talk and make it for California. So let me know.
Yeah, no, that would be great because we do, like you said, we do have the southern magnolia here. Sometimes you see them struggling, sometimes they're
Uh,
not. And then, we have a lot of not a lot compared to the East Coast, but a decent amount um, of the deciduous magnolias. And it's one of those where when people see them blooming in spring, people are like, I want that. and,
yeah. You can grow a lot of the more tender
mm-hmm,
um,
mm-hmm.
uh, Chinese species like Magnolia campbellii, which a lot of people consider the whole holy grail of magnolias. Like the only places it really does well are like northern coastal California, like the Bay Area. I'm sure Mendocino, places like that, where it can kind of mimic its native habitat, which is kind of the foothills of the Himalayan
Yeah. So I'm
mountains.
sure I'm pretty sure the San Francisco Botanical Gardens have that because
I know they do. I've
yeah.
seen them
Yeah,
there.
because they are it's a very strange. I mean, they are like I always say like sort of almost like a cloud forest. Um
Yes.
it's amazing uh, area weather phenomenon in San Francisco because you could go in winter when everything else is frozen, and I'm only 90 minutes from there too, and they'll have tropical things blooming, and you go there in
Oh
the
yeah. I
summer and
went
you
to
freeze.
one day I went or one time we had a conference in San Francisco and we got up and this was in July and it was 52 degrees and it was foggy and everybody had like down jackets on and then we drove to
hmm
UC Davis and it was like 105.
That's where that's where I live and work. So I was exactly, yeah, it was 110 here one day and everyone's going. And yeah, the temperature difference is amazing. But yeah, that's exactly where I work, UC Davis Botanical Conservatory.
Oh,
So
I
that's,
love Davis.
well, just not, well, even when it's 110, that's
Yeah,
nice.
yeah. I don't mind it because there's no humidity or
Yeah,
not much.
yeah. I'll have to give you find some of the species we have of magnolias in the conservatory. Of course, they're sad because our greenhouse isn't very tall, so we constantly have to prune them. But I need to look to see what
Yeah. Let
magnolias
me
we
know what you
have.
have. I'd be
Yeah,
curious to know.
yeah. But yeah, we'll be in touch. We'll plan something else. But this was great. This is going to help people, and I like the fact that it wasn't just so California focused because people listen from all over on this, and I need to
Yeah.
sort of broaden out. Uh, but it's know your zone. Take this information, but then do a little more local research. But,
Yes.
fall is a huge time to plant pretty much everywhere. It's time to prep your beds. And yeah, so thank you. And until next time, everyone, happy gardening.